My hand trembled as I applied lipstick for the third time this morning, the coral shade I'd worn to my daughter's wedding last spring. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman I was still getting used to, silver hair swept into a careful chignon, lines that spoke of 64 years of laughter and worry, and eyes that held more questions than answers. I stepped back, smoothing my navy dress, the one Margaret had insisted made me look distinguished, though I wondered if distinguished was just another word for old. The phone call had come 3 weeks ago, a voice I hadn't heard in 47 years, deeper now, gravelly with age, but unmistakably his. "Eleanor? It's David. David Morrison." As if I could forget. As if the boy who'd kissed me under the willow tree behind Miller's Creek, who'd promised to write every day when he left for California, who'd vanished from my life like morning mist, could ever be just another name in my past. "I'm coming back to Millbrook," he'd said, and I could hear something fragile in his voice, like glass about to shatter. I was wondering, would you like to have coffee? I know it's been a lifetime, hasn't it? A lifetime. 2 marriages for me. First to Robert, who'd given me 3 beautiful children and 28 good years before cancer took him. Then to Charles, a gentle widower who'd filled the quiet years until his heart gave out 5 winters ago. I'd assumed David had built his own life somewhere in the vastness of California, filled with children and grandchildren I'd never know, achievements I'd never hear about. Yet here I was, at 73, primping like a teenager for a reunion that felt both impossible and inevitable. The Golden Spoon Cafe sat on the corner where Murphy's Five and Dime used to be, its cheerful yellow awnings and bistro tables a modern intrusion on my memories. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a table by the window where I could watch the street and steady my nerves with the familiar rhythm of small-town life. Mrs. Henderson from the bank walked by with her Yorkshire Terrier, and Tom Bradley waved from his pickup truck. Normal things, safe things that reminded me I was still Eleanor Whitmore, retired librarian, grandmother of 7, pillar of the Presbyterian Church, not some foolish woman chasing ghosts from her youth. But when I saw him walking up the sidewalk, everything familiar fell away. He moved differently now, slower, with a careful deliberation that spoke of joints that ached in the morning and stairs that had become obstacles. His hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had gone completely white, and he wore glasses that made his eyes seem smaller, more serious. But his posture, still straight, still proud, and the way he paused to look up at the cafe's sign, tilting his head just slightly to the left as he'd always done when concentrating, these things hit me like a physical blow. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling my heart race beneath the sensible cotton of my dress. What was I doing here? What did we possibly have to say to each other after nearly 5 decades of separate lives, separate joys and sorrows, separate everything? He pushed through the cafe door, and our eyes met across the room. For a moment, we both froze, 2 old people staring at each other like teenagers caught in some elaborate prank. Then he smiled, that same lopsided grin that had made my knees weak at 17, and I felt myself smiling back before I could stop myself. "Eleanor?" He approached the table with his hands slightly outstretched, then seemed to think better of it and settled for pulling out the chair across from me. You look wonderful." "You're a terrible liar, David Morrison." The words came out before I could censor them, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "It's good to see you." He laughed, and it was exactly the sound I remembered, rich and warm. Some things never change. You always could see right through me. A young waitress with purple hair and multiple ear piercings approached our table, and I had to suppress a smile at the contrast between her modern appearance and the old-fashioned formality of our reunion. We ordered coffee, decaf for both of us, another small acknowledgement of our shared mortality, and fell into the peculiar silence of people who once knew everything about each other and now knew nothing at all. "So," I said finally, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug, "California, did it treat you well?" His face clouded slightly. "For a while. I became an engineer, like I always said I would. Worked on bridges, highways, helped build half of Los Angeles, it seems like now." He paused, studying his coffee. "I married Sarah Chin, in 1973. She was brilliant, an architect. We had 2 children, Michael and Jennifer." The past tense hung in the air between us like a held breath. "Sarah died 6 years ago," he continued quietly. "Alzheimer's. It was hard to watch someone so sharp, so creative, just disappear piece by piece." I reached across the table without thinking, covering his weathered hand with mine. "I'm so sorry, David." He looked down at our joined hands, and I was startled by how natural it felt, how right. "What about you? I heard through the grapevine that you became Mrs. Whitmore, twice, actually." "Robert first. He was the high school principal here for 30 years. Good man, steady man. We had 3 kids, Catherine, James, and little Bobby. Robert died of lung cancer in '98, never smoked a day in his life." I found myself speaking in the clipped, factual tone I used for difficult reference questions at the library. "Charles came later, a retired insurance adjuster from Portland. We had 8 good years before his heart gave out." "Any regrets?" The question was so soft I almost missed it. I pulled my hand back, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the gesture. "About what?" "About not waiting." The words hit me like a slap. I stared at him, this man who had been 19 when he'd climbed onto a Greyhound bus bound for Los Angeles, promising to send for me as soon as he got settled, as soon as he could afford to bring me out to start our life together. The man who had written 3 letters that first month, 2 the second, 1 the third, and then nothing for 47 years. "You want to talk about regrets?" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. "You want to sit here in this cafe and ask me about regrets? Eleanor, I waited, David. I waited for 6 months. 6 months of checking the mailbox every day, of making excuses to my friends about why my boyfriend never called, never wrote. 6 months of telling my parents that you were just busy, just getting established, that of course you still loved me." The cafe had grown quiet around us, and I realized I'd raised my voice. I glanced around, embarrassed, but the other patrons seemed absorbed in their own conversations, their own dramas. "I wrote," he said quietly. "God, Eleanor, I wrote you dozens of letters. I never got them. I know that now." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small yellowed envelope. "This came back to me last month. Return to sender. Addressee moved. No forwarding address." I stared at the envelope, my name written in his careful script, the address of my childhood home on Elm Street. But I lived there until I married Robert in 1979. I know. That's what I don't understand. He turned the envelope over, showing me the postal stamps and markings. "I hired a private investigator when I decided to come back here. He did some digging, and apparently," he took a deep breath, "apparently your father had the mail forwarded to a post office box for several months after I left. He was screening your correspondence." The world tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling dizzy. "What?" "He thought I wasn't good enough for you, Eleanor. The investigator found records. Your father paid the postal worker, old Jim Patterson, to redirect any mail from me to a box your father controlled. When I stopped writing after a year of letters coming back marked moved, no forwarding address, your father closed the box. The investigator found 43 letters I'd written to you, all returned unopened. I couldn't breathe. 43 letters. Nearly 4 decades of wondering, of hurt, of assuming I'd been abandoned. And there had been 43 letters. My father died 15 years ago, I whispered. I know. I'm sorry. We sat in silence, the weight of stolen time, stolen love, stolen possibilities pressing down on us like a physical thing. I thought of Robert, dear Robert, who had courted me with such patience when I was still nursing a broken heart at 22. Would I have married him if I'd known David was writing, was trying to reach me? Would my children exist? Would Robert have found someone else to love? What did the letter say? I asked finally. David's eyes filled with tears. That I loved you, that I was working 2 jobs and saving every penny to bring you to California, that I'd found us a little apartment near the beach, that I missed the way you laughed at terrible movies and how you always smelled like vanilla from helping your mother bake, that I was counting the days until I could afford to buy you a ring and make you my wife. I closed my eyes, feeling tears slip down my cheeks. David? The last letter I wrote was a year after I left. I was coming back for Christmas with enough money saved to get us started. I was going to propose under the willow tree where we first kissed. He reached across the table again, this time taking both my hands in his. When that letter came back too, I figured you'd moved on. That you'd found someone who could give you what you deserved right then, not someday in the distant future. So you moved on too. I tried to. Sarah was wonderful, Eleanor. I don't want you to think. I loved her, and we built a good life together. But there was always this hole where you used to be, this question about what might have been. I opened my eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the lines and the white hair and the slightly stooped shoulders, I could still see the boy who had taught me to skip stones at Miller's Creek, who had held me while we danced to Elvis Presley records in my parents' living room when they were at church. Why now? I asked. Why come back now? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the street where we'd both grown up, both dreamed of escape, both been shaped by forces beyond our control. Because I'm dying, he said simply. The words fell between us like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to reach the very edges of my understanding. I felt my hands go cold in his warm grasp. What? Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors give me maybe 6 months, probably less. His voice was steady, matter of fact, as if he were telling me about the weather. When I got the diagnosis, the first thing I thought wasn't about my children or my grandchildren or all the things I'd never get to do. It was about you, about this weight I've been carrying for 47 years, wondering if you hated me, if you thought I'd abandoned you. I pulled my hands free and stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. Several people turned to look at us, but I didn't care. I couldn't sit still. Couldn't process this information while trapped at a small table in a public place. I need some air, I said, and before he could respond, I was pushing through the cafe door and onto the sidewalk. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves and the promise of winter. I walked without direction, my mind reeling. David was dying. David had never stopped loving me. David had written 43 letters that I'd never received. My father had stolen nearly 50 years of our lives together. I found myself at the entrance to Riverside Park, the place where David and I had spent countless afternoons lying on the grass, making plans for our future. The willow tree was still there, larger now, its branches trailing in the slow-moving creek. I sat on the bench that hadn't existed when we were young and tried to make sense of the impossible mathematics of love and time and loss. I heard footsteps on the gravel path and knew without turning that David had followed me. He sat beside me on the bench, keeping a careful distance, respecting my need for space, even as his very presence filled all the empty places I'd learned to live with. "I shouldn't have told you like that," he said quietly. "About the cancer, that was clumsy." "Are you in pain?" "Sometimes. The medication helps." I turned to look at him, this man who had shaped my understanding of love before I even knew what love was. "What did you want from this meeting, David? What did you hope would happen?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For leaving, even though I had to. For not trying harder to reach you when the letters came back. For letting your father win." He paused, watching a red-winged blackbird perch on the willow's branches. "And I wanted to tell you that you were the great love of my life, Eleanor. That even though I was blessed to love Sarah, even though we had a good marriage and beautiful children, there was always a part of my heart that belonged to you." "David," I started to speak, then stopped. What was there to say? That he'd been the great love of my life too? That I'd named my youngest son Robert David Whitmore, telling my husband it was for my grandfather David, never admitting it was for the boy who'd broken my heart at 19? That I'd driven past the high school every year on September 15th, the anniversary of his departure, wondering if he was happy? "I don't need you to say anything," he continued. "I just needed you to know. I needed to stop carrying this alone." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children playing, their voices high and sweet in the cooling air. Life continuing, as it always did, regardless of the weight of individual sorrows and joys. 43 letters, I said finally. 43 letters. What happens now? He smiled, that same lopsided grin, though sadness had crept into the edges. Now I go back to my hotel and call my kids to tell them I've seen you. Michael lives in Seattle now. He's a doctor. Jennifer's in Portland, teaches high school English. They both have children who will grow up not remembering their grandfather very clearly. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, I drive back to San Francisco and try to put my affairs in order. Try to figure out how to say goodbye to a life that was good, even if it wasn't the one I'd planned. I stood up, brushing imaginary dust from my dress, buying myself time to think. The evening air was getting cold, and I could feel autumn settling into my bones, a reminder that I was no longer young, no longer had unlimited time for second chances. "Have dinner with me," I said suddenly. "What?" "Tonight. Have dinner with me. Not at some restaurant where we have to whisper and pretend this is normal. Come to my house. I'll cook something simple, and we can talk, really talk. We have 47 years to catch up on." He stared at me, and I could see him weighing the wisdom of prolonging this encounter, of opening wounds that might be better left alone. "Eleanor, are you sure? I don't want to make this harder than it has to be. Everything's hard at our age, David. Our bodies hurt, our friends are dying, our children worry about us, and every day we wake up is a small miracle we're not sure we deserve." I surprised myself with the fierceness in my voice. "But tonight, for a few hours, maybe we can pretend we're not two old people stumbling toward the end. Maybe we can just be David and Eleanor again." He stood slowly, his movements careful and measured, and I was reminded again of his mortality, of the cancer cells even now stealing his future. But when he looked at me, his eyes were bright with something I hadn't seen there before. "Hope. I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." As we walked back toward the street where I'd parked my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the flutter of possibility, of a story not yet finished. Tomorrow would bring reality crashing back, would force us to confront the impossible mathematics of love discovered too late. But tonight we could cook dinner and tell stories, and maybe, just maybe, find some peace in the middle of all this beautiful, terrible brokenness. The setting sun painted everything golden, and for a moment, walking beside the man who had been my first love, I felt like I was 19 again, standing on the edge of everything, unafraid of what came next. My house looked smaller somehow, with David standing in the living room, his hands clasped behind his back, as he studied the photographs scattered across the mantelpiece. 40 years of life documented in silver frames. My children's graduations, Robert's retirement party, Charles and me cutting our wedding cake, grandchildren blowing out birthday candles. A complete life, carefully curated and displayed, that had somehow always felt like it was missing its opening chapter. "You have a beautiful family," he said, picking up a photo of my daughter Catherine's wedding day. "She looks like you did at that age." I set my purse on the kitchen counter and tried to see my living room through his eyes. The floral sofa I'd picked out with Charles, the wall-to-wall carpeting Robert had insisted would be practical with small children, the collection of ceramic angels my mother had started, and I'd continued out of habit rather than affection. It was the home of a woman who had lived carefully, safely, making sensible choices and finding contentment in routine. "Would you like some wine?" I asked, suddenly nervous to be alone with him in this intimate space. "I have a bottle of Merlot Catherine brought me last Christmas. I was saving it for... well, I'm not sure what I was saving it for." "That sounds perfect." I busied myself in the kitchen, grateful for familiar tasks, opening the wine, setting out cheese and crackers, checking the roast I'd put in the slow cooker that morning, in a fit of optimism I couldn't quite explain. Through the pass-through window, I could see David examining my bookshelves, running his finger along the spines with the reverence of someone who understood that books were more than mere objects. "You kept them all," he said when I brought him a glass of wine. "Kept what?" "The books we read together. Look, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, all of Dickens." He pulled out a worn copy of Great Expectations, and I saw him smile at something tucked between the pages. "Is this?" He held up a pressed wildflower, its purple petals faded but still intact. I felt my cheeks warm with embarrassment. "You gave me that the day before you left. You said it was a forget-me-not, that I should keep it to remember you." I took a sip of wine, letting its warmth steady my voice. Silly, really, keeping it all these years. Not silly at all. He carefully replaced the flower and returned the book to its place on the shelf. I kept something too. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a small photograph, creased and yellowed with age. It was a picture of us at the county fair, my head thrown back in laughter at something he'd said, his arm around my shoulders, both of us impossibly young and radiant with first love. "My wallet's been through 2 marriages, 3 moves across country, and countless renovations," he said quietly, "but this picture has been in it every day for 47 years. I took the photo from his hands, studying our younger selves. We looked so certain, so convinced that love was enough to conquer any obstacle. When had I stopped believing that? When had I learned to settle for contentment instead of reaching for joy? "I burned all our pictures when I got married the first time," I admitted. "It seemed unfair to Robert, keeping reminders of someone else. I regretted it almost immediately." "That was probably the right thing to do." Was it? I don't know anymore. Sometimes I think we spend so much time doing the right thing that we forget to do the true thing. David moved closer to where I stood by the window, close enough that I could smell his cologne, different now, more expensive than the drugstore aftershave had worn as a boy, but somehow it made me remember dancing in my parents' basement, how safe I'd felt in his arms. What would have been the true thing, Eleanor? The question hung between us, loaded with 47 years of unspoken possibilities. I could feel my heart beating faster, could feel 17-year-old Eleanor stirring somewhere deep inside my 64-year-old body. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe keeping one picture. Maybe not burning your letters, the 3 I did receive. Maybe not letting my father convince me that you were just a boy with big dreams and no substance. He said that? Among other things. He said boys like you came through small towns all the time, filling girls' heads with fantasies about California and bright lights and easy money. He said you'd forget me the moment you saw your first movie starlet walking down Sunset Boulevard. David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at my small backyard, where early evening shadows were gathering beneath the oak tree. He wasn't entirely wrong, he said finally. California was full of boys like me, dreaming big and working small jobs and believing we could reinvent ourselves. The difference was that I already knew who I wanted to be. I wanted to be the man who was worthy of Eleanor Patterson. Eleanor Patterson Morrison, I corrected automatically, then caught myself. God, listen to me. I haven't been Eleanor Patterson in 45 years. But you were, once. You were Eleanor Patterson who wanted to see the ocean, who dreamed of living in a house with a front porch and a garden full of roses. You were Eleanor Patterson who cried at sad movies and laughed at my terrible jokes and believed that love could conquer anything if you just held on tight enough. He was standing so close now that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the lines that fanned out from their corners. Age had been kind to him in some ways. There was a gravity to his features now, a depth that hadn't been there when he was 19. But underneath the changes, he was still David, still the boy who had seen something in me that I hadn't even known was there. What are you asking me, David? I'm asking if she's still in there somewhere. Eleanor Patterson, the girl who wasn't afraid to want impossible things. The timer in the kitchen chose that moment to chime, and I stepped back, breaking the spell that had been weaving itself around us. Dinner's ready. But as I moved toward the kitchen, David caught my hand. Eleanor, wait. I turned back to him, and in his eyes I saw something that made my breath catch. Not just nostalgia or regret, but desire. Real, present-tense desire from a man who was looking at me not as I had been, but as I was now. In this moment, 64 years old and silver-haired and lined with experiences he'd never shared. I know this is impossible, he said quietly. I know we're not the same people we were, and I know I have no right to walk back into your life after all this time and ask for anything. But Eleanor, these last 3 weeks since I called you, I've felt more alive than I have in years. Just knowing I was going to see you again, just imagining your voice, your face, it's given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. The word fell between us like a bridge, spanning decades and disappointment and all the careful reasons why this was foolish. I could feel myself standing at a crossroads, could almost see the path I'd been walking for 47 years. Safe, predictable, lined with sensible choices and comfortable compromises. And the other path, the one that led into unknown territory with no guarantees, except the promise of feeling fully, completely alive. David, you're sick, you're dying. What kind of hope is there in that? The kind that says, even if we only have 6 months, even if we only have 6 weeks, maybe we can have them together. Maybe we can stop wondering what if and find out what is. He paused, searching my face for some sign of possibility. I know it's crazy. I know it's not practical or sensible or fair to anyone. What about your children? What would they think? Michael and Jennifer want me to be happy. They've been worried about me since Sarah died, afraid I'd just give up. When I told them I was coming back to find you, Jenny said it was the most hopeful she'd heard me sound in years. I pulled my hand free and went to tend to dinner, needing the familiar ritual of serving food to ground me in reality. But even as I carved the roast and spooned potatoes onto our plates, I could feel the weight of his gaze, could sense him watching me with the intensity of a man who had run out of time for anything but truth. We ate mostly in silence, the conversation flowing around safer topics, his work as an engineer, my years at the library, the changes in our small town since he'd been gone. But underneath the polite exchanges, I could feel something building, some reckoning that couldn't be postponed much longer. It was only when I was clearing the dessert plates, store-bought apple pie that neither of us had done more than nibble, that he finally said what I'd been dreading and hoping to hear all evening. "Come with me." I set the plates down carefully, not trusting my hands to be steady. "What?" "Come back to California with me. Not forever, not for any promises I can't keep. Just come be with me while there's still time." "David, I can't just—" "Why not?" He stood up from the table, moving with sudden urgency. "What's keeping you here, Eleanor, really?" "My children, my grandchildren, my life." "Your children are grown. Your grandchildren love you, but they don't need you the way they once did. And your life?" He gestured around the tidy kitchen, the carefully maintained house. "This isn't living, Eleanor. This is existing. This is marking time." His words stung because they carried too much truth. Since Charles' death 5 years ago, my days had settled into a pattern so predictable it was almost algorithmic. Morning coffee and the newspaper, volunteer work at the library Tuesday and Thursday, bridge club on Wednesdays, Sunday dinner with Catherine's family when they were in town, television in the evenings, book at bedtime, lights out by 10. I have responsibilities. To who? To what? David moved around the table and took my hands again, and this time I didn't pull away. "Eleanor, I'm not asking you to marry me or make me promises about forever. I'm asking you to take a chance. One last, beautiful, impossible chance. You're asking me to watch you die?" The words came out harsh, more brutal than I'd intended, but they hung in the air between us like an accusation. "Yes," he said simply, "I suppose I am. But I'm also asking you to help me live, whatever time I have left. Really live, not just endure." I thought of Sarah, the woman he'd married, the woman who'd had 40 years of his love and attention. Had she died knowing she was cherished? Had she felt lucky, even in the midst of losing herself to disease, to be loved so completely? "I don't know how to do this, David. I don't know how to be reckless at 64. "Neither do I," he smiled, and for a moment the years fell away again. But maybe that's what makes it an adventure. Outside, night had fallen completely, and I could hear the sounds of my neighborhood settling into evening routines. Mrs. Henderson calling her dog in from the yard, the Paulson teenagers arriving home with music playing too loudly from their car stereo. Normal sounds of normal lives, lived by people who made careful plans and reasonable decisions. "How long would we have?" I asked. And even as the words left my mouth, I was surprised to hear myself asking practical questions instead of giving all the reasons why this was impossible. The doctor said 3 to 6 months before I need more intensive care. But I feel good right now, Eleanor. I feel strong. We could travel a little, see the ocean you always wanted to see. I have a house in Sausalito, right on the water. We could watch the sunset every night and pretend we're 20 again. And when you get sicker, then you come home and you tell people you had the most beautiful 3 months of your life. And I die knowing that the last chapter of my story was everything I dreamed it could be. The practical part of my mind, the part that had guided me safely through 64 years of life, began cataloging all the reasons this was insane. The logistics alone were overwhelming. What would I tell my children? How could I abandon my responsibilities, my commitments, my carefully constructed life for what might be nothing more than an old man's romantic fantasy? But another part of me, a part I thought was dead and buried, was stirring to life. The part that had once dreamed of adventure and grand gestures and love stories that defied logic. the part that had been Eleanor Patterson before she learned to be sensible. "I need time to think," I said finally. David nodded, though I could see disappointment flicker across his face. "Of course, it's a lot to ask. It's everything to ask." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "This is my hotel information and my cell phone number. I'm planning to drive back to California on Sunday. That's 3 days. If you decide you want to try this impossible thing, meet me at the hotel Sunday morning. If not," he shrugged, trying for casual and not quite achieving it. "If not, then thank you for tonight. Thank you for letting me apologize, for giving me the chance to tell you what you meant to me." I took the paper, my fingers brushing against his as I did. Such a small touch, but it sent electricity shooting up my arm, reminding me that despite everything, despite age and loss and the passage of nearly 5 decades, my body still remembered his. "David, don't say anything else tonight," he said gently. "Don't make any promises or give me any reasons. Just think about it. Think about what Eleanor Patterson would do." He leaned over and kissed my cheek, a soft, careful kiss that felt like both hello and goodbye. Then he was gone, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the taste of possibility on my lips and his phone number clutched in my hand. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere out there, David was driving back to his hotel room, probably wondering if he'd just made a complete fool of himself. Somewhere out there, my children were living their lives, secure in the knowledge that their mother was safely ensconced in her predictable routine. Somewhere out there, the sun was setting over the California coast, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that I'd imagined 1,000 times but never seen. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Catherine's number. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before I set the phone aside. What would I say? How do you tell your 40-year-old daughter that you're thinking of running away with your first love? How do you explain that sometimes, even at 64, you need to choose possibility over safety? Instead, I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept my jewelry box. Hidden beneath the sensible pearl necklaces and understated earrings was a small velvet pouch I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a simple silver ring set with a tiny blue stone. Not an engagement ring, but a promise ring David had given me for my 18th birthday, a month before he left for California. I slipped it onto my finger, and despite everything, the weight I'd gained, the arthritis that was beginning to gnarl my joints, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for me to remember who I used to be. 3 days. 3 days to decide whether to close the book on Eleanor Patterson once and for all, or to find out what happened when you gave her one last chance to write her own ending. I stayed awake most of the night, weighing impossible choices and trying to imagine explanations I could live with. By dawn, I still didn't have an answer. But for the first time in years, I had a question that made my heart race with something other than anxiety. What if? The question followed me through the next 2 days like a song I couldn't get out of my head. What if I said yes? What if I was brave enough at 64 to choose love over safety? What if David was right and this wasn't just the foolish dream of 2 old people trying to recapture something that was gone forever? Saturday morning found me in my garden, pulling weeds with unnecessary vigor, as if physical activity could somehow organize the chaos in my mind. The October air was crisp and sweet, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and I tried to lose myself in the rhythm of tending to growing things. But every few minutes, I would catch myself staring off into the distance, thinking about ocean sunsets and second chances. "Mom?" I looked up to see Catherine walking across my lawn, her car parked in the driveway behind mine. My daughter had inherited my height and her father's dark hair, but her expression of concerned determination was pure Patterson. She was wearing her mom needs intervention face, the same one she'd worn when she'd convinced me to sell the big house after Charles died, to move into this smaller, more manageable place. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" I pulled off my gardening gloves, suddenly conscious of how I must look, dirt-stained and wind-blown, my hair escaping from the careful bun I'd pinned it into that morning. Betty Chambers called me. Catherine settled onto the garden bench Robert had built for me 20 years ago, her movements careful and deliberate. "She said she saw you having coffee with some man on Thursday and that you looked upset." I should have known. In a town the size of Millbrook, having coffee with a stranger was as good as taking out an ad in the weekly paper. I wasn't upset. She said you were crying. I was not crying. I sat beside her on the bench, brushing soil from my knees. There might have been some emotion. It was an emotional conversation. "Mom." Catherine turned to face me fully, and I could see worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there even a year ago. My practical daughter, my responsible firstborn, who had inherited all of Robert's steady dependability and none of my youthful romanticism. Who was he? I could lie. I could make up some story about an old friend passing through town, someone from the library association, a distant cousin. Catherine would believe me because she trusted me, because in 64 years I had never given her reason to doubt my word. But sitting there in the garden with my hands still dirty from the earth, wearing the promise ring I'd hidden for 47 years, I found I didn't want to lie anymore. His name is David Morrison. We knew each other when we were young. How young? High school. We dated before he left for California. Catherine was quiet for a moment, processing this information. The David from your senior year? The one who was going to send for you? I stared at her in surprise. You remember that? Mom, you talked about him for years. Every time we drove past the old Miller place, every time someone mentioned California, every time we watched those old movies you loved. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. Dad knew about him too. He used to say David Morrison was the luckiest, unlucky man in the world. Your father said that? He said David was lucky because he'd been loved by you, but unlucky because he was too young and too foolish to fight for it. Catherine reached over and took my hand, her fingers finding the ring I'd forgotten I was wearing. Mom, what is this? I looked down at the simple silver band, the blue stone catching the morning light. Something I should have put away a long time ago. Or something you should have worn all along. She turned my hand over, studying the ring. He gave this to you, didn't he? David, how did you? Because I know you, Mom. You don't keep things that don't matter. You've thrown away Christmas cards and old magazines and clothes that didn't fit, but you kept this ring for 47 years. She looked up at me with eyes so much like her father's, kind, understanding, infinitely patient. What did he want, Mom? Why is he here now? I told her everything, about the phone call, about the letters our grandfather had hidden, about David's diagnosis, about his impossible proposal that I drop everything and spend his last months with him in California. Catherine listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. So he wants you to give up your life here to go watch him die, she said when I finished. That's a rather harsh way to put it, but accurate. I stood up from the bench and walked to the edge of the garden, where Robert's roses were preparing for winter, their last blooms fading but still beautiful. Catherine, what was I like when I was young? Mom, I'm serious. What was I like before I became your mother, before I learned to be sensible and practical and safe? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, When she spoke, her voice was soft, thoughtful. You were electric. That's the word Dad used. He said when he first saw you, you were like lightning in a bottle, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to predict. He said falling in love with you was the most terrifying thing he'd ever done because he never knew if you might just decide to set the world on fire. And then? And then you had us kids, and you settled down, and you became the mother we needed. Steady, reliable, always there. She paused. But sometimes, when you thought we weren't looking, we'd catch glimpses of the lightning. I turned back to face her, this daughter who had inherited more of my perception than I'd realized. What would your father think about David coming back, about what he's asking me to do? I think Dad would want you to be happy. I think he'd want you to have whatever time you have left filled with joy, instead of just routine. Catherine stood and walked over to me, taking my hands in hers. But Mom, I'm scared. I'm scared of losing you to some romantic fantasy. I'm scared of you getting hurt again. And I'm scared what happens when he dies and you're alone in California with strangers. So you think I should say no? I think, she squeezed my hands, I think you should do whatever makes you feel most alive, even if it scares the hell out of the rest of us. The words hung between us in the crisp October air, carrying more permission than I'd expected, more understanding than I dared hope for. James and Bobby would never understand, I said, thinking of my sons, one who'd inherited Robert's cautious pragmatism, the other Charles's need for order and predictability. Maybe not at first, but they love you, Mom. We all love you. And we've watched you marking time for the past 5 years, ever since Charles died. We've watched you get smaller and quieter and more careful, and it breaks our hearts. I haven't gotten smaller. Haven't you? Catherine smiled sadly. When's the last time you drove somewhere you'd never been? When's the last time you stayed up past midnight because you were having too much fun to go to bed? When's the last time you did something just because it felt good, not because it was responsible or expected or safe? I couldn't answer because the truth was too stark to voice. Somewhere in the process of becoming a wife and mother and widow, I had indeed gotten smaller. I had learned to want less, to expect less, to settle for the comfortable certainty of routine over the terrifying possibility of joy. He leaves tomorrow, I said quietly. Then you need to decide tonight. Catherine hugged me then, holding me tight the way she had when she was small and the world seemed too big and frightening to navigate alone. But now she was the one offering comfort, the one strong enough to let me go. Whatever you decide, I'll support you, she whispered against my hair. But please, Mom, don't choose out of fear. Choose because it's what you really want. After she left, I spent the afternoon putting my house in order with the methodical precision of a woman preparing for a long journey. I paid bills that weren't due for weeks, organized my jewelry box, wrote notes to the bridge club and the library volunteers, explaining that I might be taking an extended trip to visit family. As evening approached, I found myself standing in my bedroom, staring at the contents of my closet as if they might provide answers to questions I was still afraid to ask. What did a 64-year-old woman pack for a cross-country adventure with her dying first love? What did you bring when you were leaving everything familiar behind for something that might be beautiful or might be a disaster? I pulled out my goods suitcase, the one I'd bought for my honeymoon with Charles but had rarely used since, and began to pack. A few dresses, comfortable shoes, the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. Then, on impulse, I added the red silk scarf Catherine had brought me from Italy, the one I'd never worn because it seemed too bright, too attention-seeking for a librarian in a small town. The phone rang as I was folding my nightgowns, and for a moment my heart stopped, thinking it might be David calling to tell me he'd changed his mind, that he'd realized how foolish this whole plan was. But it was James, my middle child, calling from Chicago, where he worked as an accountant and lived a life of impressive predictability. Mom, Catherine called me. She said you're thinking of California with some guy from high school?" I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone cradled against my ear, and tried to find words that would make sense to my practical son. His name is David, and we cared about each other very much when we were young. But Mom, that was 50 years ago. People change. You don't really know this man anymore. I know he's dying, James. I know he's alone. I know he was the first person to make me believe I was worth loving. You have family here who love you. You have a life, responsibilities. I have bridge club and volunteer work and a house that's too quiet and too empty. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. James, honey, I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm trying to figure out if there's still time for one more adventure. What if he's not the man you remember? What if this whole thing is some kind of scam? I almost laughed at the idea of David Morrison, engineering consultant and widowed father of two, running romantic con games on elderly women. It's not a scam, sweetheart. But what if you get out there and it's terrible? What if you're miserable? What if he dies and you're stuck in California with no one? What if? What if? What if? The refrain of a life lived safely, always anticipating disaster, always prepared for disappointment. Then I come home, I said simply. Then I come home having tried something brave instead of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I just don't want you to get hurt, Mom. Oh, honey, I felt tears prick at my eyes. I'm going to get hurt either way. If I go, I'll have to watch someone I love die. If I stay, I'll have to live with knowing I was too afraid to love him while he was alive. When would you leave? Tomorrow morning. If I'm going to do this, I need to do it before I lose my nerve. Another long pause. Do you want me to drive down tonight? I could be there in 4 hours. No, sweetheart. This is something I need to decide by myself. Okay, he sighed, a sound that carried all his worry and love and reluctant acceptance. But Mom, call me every day. Promise me he'll call every day. I promise. After I hung up, I continued packing, adding practical things, medications, comfortable walking shoes, the thick cardigan I wore when the evening air turned cool. But I also added impractical things, the red scarf, a bottle of expensive perfume I'd been saving for a special occasion that had never come, the silk nightgown I'd bought on a whim and never worn. By 10 o'clock, my suitcase was packed and sitting by the front door like a declaration of intent. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Robert's old chair, trying to imagine what he would think of all this. Would he be hurt that I was choosing David over the memory of our life together? Would he understand that loving someone new didn't diminish what we'd shared? I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of rain against the windows and the gray light of early dawn creeping through the curtains. For a moment, I couldn't remember why my suitcase was by the door, why I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff with my arms spread wide. Then it all came rushing back. David, California, the choice I had to make in the next few hours. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing a blue dress that brought out my eyes and the pearl earrings Charles had given me for my 60th birthday. If I was going to show up at David's hotel room, I wanted to look like a woman worth waiting 47 years for. The drive to the Millbrook Inn took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing a continent. With every block, I found new reasons to turn around. What would people think? What if I was making a fool of myself? What if David had changed his mind overnight and checked out early to avoid the awkwardness of my rejection? But I kept driving because somewhere between Catherine's visit and James' phone call, I had realized something important. I had spent 64 years being the person other people needed me to be, the dutiful daughter, the supportive wife, the responsible mother. For once, just once, I wanted to be the person I needed me to be. The parking lot of the Millbark Inn was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to traveling salesmen and families passing through on their way to somewhere more exciting. David's rental car, a sensible silver sedan that looked exactly like something a careful man in his 70s would choose, was parked near the lobby entrance. I sat in my car for 5 minutes, watching the rain streak down my windshield and trying to find the courage to walk through those doors. This was it, the moment when I either stepped into an unknown future or drove home to the safety of my familiar life. I thought about Eleanor Patterson, 17 years old and fearless, who had believed that love could conquer anything if you just held on tight enough. I thought about the promise ring on my finger, hidden under sensible gloves for 47 years. I thought about David, probably pacing his hotel room, wondering if I would show up, or if he'd spend the drive back to California nursing another broken heart. I got out of the car. The lobby of the Millbrook Inn smelled like industrial carpet and coffee that had been brewing too long, but to me, it smelled like possibility. The desk clerk, a young woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Ashley, looked up as I approached. "I'm here to see David Morrison," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Room..." I realized I didn't know his room number. "He's in 237, Ashley said with a smile. "The elevator's just around the corner." I rode the elevator to the second floor, my heart beating so hard I was sure the other passengers could hear it. But the elevator was empty, except for me and my reflection in the polished doors. A woman in a blue dress and pearls, carrying a small suitcase and wearing an expression of terrified determination. Room 237 was at the end of the hall. I stood in front of the door for a long moment, my hand raised to knock, still not entirely sure what I was going to say. Then I heard movement inside, the sound of someone walking across the room, and before I could lose my nerve, I knocked. The door opened, and there was David, dressed in khakis and a blue button-down shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Two old people standing in a hotel hallway, trying to bridge 47 years with a single glance. "Eleanor," his voice was soft, wondering, as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. "I brought a suitcase," I said, which wasn't at all what I'd planned to say, but it seemed to sum up everything important about why I was there. His face transformed, worry and hope giving way to something that looked like pure joy. "Does that mean?" "It means I want to try." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would make them easier to take back if I changed my mind. "I want to try this impossible thing. I want to see the ocean and eat dinner on your porch and wake up every morning knowing I chose love over safety." He stepped aside to let me into the room, and I saw that his own suitcase was already packed and waiting by the window. A man prepared for either outcome, but hoping for the one that included me. "Eleanor, are you sure? Really sure? Because once we leave here, once we drive away from everything you know, there's no going back. Not to the way things were." I set my suitcase down next to his and turned to face him, this man who had shaped my understanding of love before I even knew what love was. "I've been going back for 47 years, David. I've been living in the past, in the safety of what I've already survived. But you're right, I'm not just existing anymore. Starting right now, I'm choosing to live." He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and pulled me into his arms. And suddenly, I was 17 again, dancing in my parents' basement, believing that the whole world was spread out before us like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. "Are you ready for an adventure, Eleanor Patterson?" he whispered against my hair. I pulled back to look at him, this man who was giving me the chance to rewrite the ending of my story, to discover what happened when you stopped being afraid of what you might lose and started focusing on what you might find. "I've been ready for 47 years, I said, and meant it. An hour later, we were driving west on Highway 80, the rain having given way to unexpected sunshine that painted the autumn landscape in shades of gold and scarlet. David drove carefully, like the older man he was, but there was something young and alive in his posture, something that spoke of new beginnings rather than final chapters. I called Catherine from somewhere outside of Columbus, watching the Ohio countryside roll past the passenger window, while I explained that I was heading to California with David Morrison, and that I'd call her every day, and that yes, I was absolutely certain this was what I wanted to do. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I'm scared for you, but I'm proud of you." "I'm scared too," I admitted, "but it's a good kind of scared. It's the kind of scared that means you're really living." We drove for hours, stopping only for gas and coffee and the quiet conversations that come when two people are getting to know each other all over again. David told me about his years in California, about the bridges he'd built and the life he'd constructed with Sarah. I told him about my children, about Robert's steady kindness and Charles' gentle humor, about the library where I'd worked for 20 years and the books that had sustained me through the lonely times. But mostly we talked about the present, the landscape scrolling past our windows, the music on the radio, the small miracle of being together in this car, in this moment, after nearly 5 decades of separation. As the sun began to set somewhere in western Kansas, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, David reached over and took my hand. "No regrets?" he asked. I looked at our joined hands, his weathered and marked with age spots, mine soft from years of hand cream and careful living, and felt something settle in my chest, something that had been restless and unsatisfied for longer than I cared to admit. "No regrets," I said, and meant it. Outside the car windows, the world was vast and full of possibilities. Ahead of us lay California and the Pacific Ocean, and whatever time we had left to write the ending to a love story that had begun when we were barely more than children. Behind us lay everything safe and familiar and carefully constructed. But for the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward, into the uncertainty and the adventure and the beautiful, terrifying promise of loving someone completely, even when you know you're going to lose them. Even when you know that loving them is going to break your heart all over again. Even when you know it's the most important thing you'll ever do. The highway stretched ahead of us, leading west toward the setting sun, and I squeezed David's hand and prepared to find out what happened when Eleanor Patterson finally came home.